The wagon hit a rut so deep that Mara grabbed the wooden bench with both hands just to keep from pitching forward into the mud. "Careful," said the driver, though he didn't slow down. He hadn't said much else the entire 3 hours since they'd left Calverton behind. His name was Hicks. She'd gathered that from the livery stable man who'd pointed her toward him, and he had the particular silence of someone who'd decided long before the journey started that she wasn't worth talking to. She didn't argue with that. She'd stopped arguing with things she couldn't change somewhere around the time her Aunt Clara had handed her that envelope with $32 inside and told her, very kindly, very firmly, that she needed to make her own arrangements now. Make your own arrangements, like she was a piece of furniture that had been left in the wrong room. Mara pressed her shoulder against the wagon's side panel and watched the landscape change. Back in Calverton, the town had the familiar softness of settled country, painted storefronts, elm trees lining the main street, women in decent coats walking with purpose. Out here, the land didn't apologize for itself. The hills rose sharp and treeless against a November sky, the color of old iron. The grass had gone yellow and flat. Every so often, a crow lifted off a fence post as they passed, like it was reconsidering its options. She was reconsidering her own. The advertisement had been pinned to the board outside the Calverton post office, which was the kind of place where desperate people looked for lifelines. Housekeeper needed. Iron Ridge Ranch, remote location, serious inquiries only, compensation provided. Contact Mercer. There was an address in Harlow, a town she'd never heard of, and a name that gave nothing away. She'd written the letter sitting on her Aunt Clara's spare bed with the thin mattress and the window that faced a brick wall, and she'd been as honest as she thought was safe to be. She had experience managing a household. She was capable of hard work. She was looking for a position of some permanence. She did not mention that she was 26 years old and had been passed between relatives since she was 14, that her father had died of pneumonia and her mother of something quieter and harder to name, that she had never once in her life had a space she could call genuinely hers. The reply came 11 days later. One sentence: "Come to Harlow on the 14th and ask for the Iron Ridge wagon." No greeting, no details. Just a command, which she supposed told her something about the man who'd written it. The wagon lurched again, and Hicks muttered something under his breath. "How much farther?" Mara asked. "About 40 minutes. He paused. "If the creek ain't flooded." She chose not to ask what happened if it was. The creek wasn't flooded. It was, however, running high and fast with gray-brown water that Hicks studied for a long moment before clicking the horses forward with the practiced calm of someone who'd made peace with the possibility of drowning. Mara kept both hands on the bench and didn't breathe properly until the wheels found purchase on the far bank. Iron Ridge appeared around the next long curve, tucked against the base of a hill that had probably been significant to someone once and was now just a wall of rock and scrub. The ranch itself was larger than she'd expected: a main house, 2 outbuildings, a barn, and a corral where 3 horses stood with their backs to the wind. The house had been painted white at some point in its history. What remained was closer to gray. Hicks pulled the wagon up to the front and set the brake without ceremony. "This is it," he said. "Yes," Mara agreed. "I can see that." She climbed down herself, because he didn't offer to help, and retrieved her bag from the wagon bed. It was a heavy bag for what little was in it: 2 changes of clothes, her mother's small hand mirror, a book of pressed botanical illustrations she'd carried since childhood, and the $32, which she'd sewn into the lining of her coat the night before leaving Calverton. She heard the front door before she saw it open. The man who came out was tall, taller than she'd somehow imagined from that terse letter, with dark hair gone gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by too much sun and too much trouble into something that read younger than it was until you got close, and then seemed much older. He wore a work shirt that had been mended at both elbows. His boots were caked with mud. He stood at the top of the 2 porch steps and looked at her the way she'd once seen a foreman look at a shipment of timber that wasn't quite the right cut, assessing. Not unkind exactly, but not warm. "Miss Whitlock?" he said. "Yes." "Silas Mercer." He didn't extend his hand. "You're smaller than I expected." "I'm sorry to disappoint you." Something shifted in his expression, brief and unreadable. "I didn't say it was a disappointment. I said it was unexpected." He glanced at her bag. "Is that all you brought?" "It's all I have." Another pause. He seemed to be recalculating something internally. Then he stepped back from the door. Come inside, then. It's cold. The kitchen was the warmest room, which seemed to be less by design and more because someone had left a fire going out of habit. The rest of the house was the kind of cold that settles into walls over weeks rather than hours. The deep chill of rooms that aren't used enough to stay warm. Mara stood in the kitchen doorway and took in what she could while Silas moved to the stove and poured coffee into two mismatched mugs without asking whether she wanted any. The kitchen was large and would have been functional once, a wide iron range, a long work table, shelves with enough crockery for a proper household. But there was a layer of disorder that spoke of months rather than days. Dishes waiting to be properly cleaned, a flour sack left open, a row of boots by the back door that no one had thought to line up straight, the kind of mess that accumulates when someone is surviving rather than living. He set one of the mugs on the table without ceremony and pulled out a chair across from it, sitting down. She took the seat he'd indicated. The coffee was terrible. She drank it anyway. The work isn't easy, he said, not looking at her but at the table. He had big hands, the kind built for physical labor, and he wrapped them around his mug like he needed something to hold. The last woman I hired lasted 6 weeks. One before that, 4. I'm not going to lie to you about what this place is. What is this place? He finally looked up. A lot of work and not much reward. 3 children who are not easy right now. A ranch that's not doing what it should be. And a winter that's going to be harder than last year, which was already bad enough. Mara wrapped her own hands around the mug. How old are the children? Oldest is 11, Eliza. Then Daniel, he's 8. Then Ruth, she just turned 6. He said their names like he was reading from a list, which she recognized as the voice of someone forcing themselves to stay practical because the alternative was too much. Their mother passed 14 months ago. I'm sorry. He acknowledged this with a slight nod and nothing more. They need someone who can run the house and look after them when I'm working. Someone who'll stay. He looked at her directly. I noticed you didn't list any references in your letter. I didn't have any to list. Why not? It was a fair question, and she'd known it would come. Because I've spent the last several years caring for family members who didn't survive to write letters on my behalf, she said. And before that, I was the one who needed looking after. He studied her for a moment. You're an orphan. I was. Now I'm just someone looking for a position. She met his gaze steadily. I'm a hard worker, Mr. Mercer. I don't quit when things get difficult, and I don't need to be managed. What I need is a fair wage and a room of my own, and in exchange I'll run this house the way it should be run. That's all I'm offering, and I think that's all you're asking for. Something in the set of his mouth shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting. $40 a month, he said. Room in the back. Sundays are your own after morning chores. You leave when you want to leave, but I'd ask you not to leave in the middle of winter if you can help it. That seems fair? All right. He stood, picking up his mug. I'll show you around, and then I need to get back to the barn. She stood. I'd like to meet the children. They know you're coming. He moved toward the hallway. That doesn't mean they'll be happy about it. He hadn't been wrong. They were in the front room, what might have been a parlor once, though it had given up on that particular ambition. And they had clearly arranged themselves in the specific way of children who want to look like they're not waiting for something while very obviously waiting for something. Eliza sat in the chair nearest the window, with a book open in her lap. Daniel was on the floor with a collection of carved wooden horses he immediately began looking at with great concentration. Ruth was standing beside the fireplace with her hands clasped in front of her, which Mara would come to understand was Ruth's resting position when she didn't know what to do with herself. Silas said, This is Miss Whitlock. She'll be helping run the house. Eliza looked up from her book. She had her father's dark hair and Mara suspected considerably more of her mother's personality. Her eyes were sharp and assessing in a way that was unsettling in an 11-year-old. Are you going to stay? She asked. I'm planning to, Mara said. Mrs. Holt didn't stay. Miss Pierce didn't stay either. Eliza, Silas said, a warning in it. I'm just saying, Eliza said, not defensively, but factually, the way a person states something they consider to be relevant data. Those women made their own choices, Mara said. I've made mine. She looked at the girl directly. And I don't generally change my mind. Eliza held her gaze for a moment, measuring something. Then she looked back at her book. Daniel had not looked up from his horses, which was its own kind of statement. Ruth, on the other hand, had been watching Mara with eyes that were wide and dark, and reminded Mara of nothing so much as a small animal that had been frightened too recently to trust anything yet. When Mara looked at her, she didn't look away. "Hello, Ruth," Mara said gently. "Hello," said Ruth, in a voice barely above a whisper. Silas cleared his throat. "I'll show you to your room." The room was small. There was a bed with a rope mattress and a quilt that had been washed so many times the colors had softened into impressions of themselves. A window facing east, a dresser with one handle missing on the bottom drawer, a hook on the back of the door. It was the most privacy Mara had had in 4 years. She set her bag on the bed and stood very still for a moment, just inside the door, taking that in. "It's not much," Silas said from the doorway. "It's fine," she said, and meant it in a way he probably didn't understand. "It's good." He seemed uncertain what to do with that. "Supper's usually at 6. I'd start with something simple tonight. There's salt pork and dried beans in the larder. Eliza knows where things are if you need help finding them." "I'll manage." He nodded. Didn't move immediately. She got the sense that he was about to say something and then thought better of it. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing." He turned to go. "Mr. Mercer." He stopped. "I know this isn't easy, having a stranger in your house. I know it's not what you'd choose if you had better options." She paused, searching for the words that were honest without being brutal. "But I'm going to do my best by this family. All I'm asking is that you give me enough time to show you that." He looked at her for a long moment. His face was difficult to read. Not deliberately closed, she thought, just genuinely complicated. A man with too much going on behind the surface to let any of it show easily. "Fair enough," he said. He left. She heard his boots on the stairs, then the front door, then silence. She unpacked her bag methodically, clothes in the dresser, mirror on the windowsill, book of botanical illustrations on the bed where she could reach it, and then stood at the window and looked out at the yard where the horses stood in the failing afternoon light, and the hills beyond turned purple as the sun dropped behind them. She'd been in worse places, she told herself. She tried to believe it. Supper was, objectively, not her finest hour. She found the larder well enough and the beans were where Eliza had quietly indicated. But the stove had a temperamental draft that kept reducing the heat at critical moments. And the salt pork was fattier than she'd anticipated. And by the time Silas came in from the barn and the children came to the table, what she'd been aiming for was serviceable, but what she'd produced was, honest, barely that. Silas looked at the bowl in front of him for a moment without speaking. "The stove draft," Mara said. "I'll understand it better tomorrow." "It sticks," Daniel said without looking up. It was the first thing he'd said directly to her. "You have to wedge it open with the poker or it slides shut." "Thank you," Mara said. "I'll remember that." He shrugged and pushed the beans around his bowl. Ruth ate with careful deliberateness, like someone who had been told to finish her plate often enough that finishing her plate had become a matter of principle. She kept her eyes down, but Mara noticed her glancing up every few minutes. Quick looks, immediately dropped, as if she was watching something she wasn't sure she was allowed to see. Eliza ate without complaint, which Mara chose to read as generous given the beans. Silas ate without comment, which was either the same thing or not. After supper, she cleaned up while the children did whatever children did in the hours before bed, which in this case seemed to involve Eliza reading by lamplight, Daniel working on one of the wooden horses with what appeared to be a chisel he probably shouldn't have had access to, and Ruth sitting in the corner of the kitchen watching Mara work. "You don't have to sit there," Mara said, not unkindly as she scrubbed the pot. "You can go be with your brother and sister." "I know," said Ruth. She didn't move. Mara didn't push it. She just went on scrubbing. After a while, Ruth said, "Your hair's pretty." Mara glanced at her. Ruth was looking at the floor now, as if she regretted saying it. "Thank you," Mara said. "I think yours is prettier." Ruth's hair was a lighter brown than her siblings', with a natural wave that had gotten rather tangled over the course of the day. Someone had made an attempt at 2 braids that had not survived to their destination. Ruth didn't respond, but when Mara looked again, there was the ghost of something pleased in her expression. The first week was largely about learning which problems were acute and which were simply chronic. The acute ones she could see. The kitchen needed reorganizing. The children's clothes needed mending. The cellar was storing root vegetables in a way that was going to result in rot within the month, and someone had to actually tell Daniel to wash his face in the mornings, since he appeared to have been handling that entirely on the honor system. The chronic ones were harder to identify because they'd been lived with long enough that nobody mentioned them. The way Eliza took charge of things without being asked, not because she wanted to be in charge, but because someone had to be, and she'd decided it was her. The way Daniel went quiet at odd moments, mid-sentence, mid-meal, and came back from wherever he went with slightly too much energy, like he was overcompensating. The way Ruth followed Mara around the house with a constancy that was equal parts touching and heartbreaking, because she'd clearly latched onto Mara not because of anything Mara had done, but simply because Mara was there. Silas was in the barn before dawn and back at dusk, and rarely in between. When he was in the house, he moved through it with the efficiency of someone who has reduced all non-essential functions to zero. He ate. He spoke to the children in the short, careful sentences of a man who knows he's doing this wrong and is trying not to make it worse. He acknowledged Mara's presence with nods and single-word exchanges that were civil without being communicative. She didn't push. She'd learned young that pushing men like Silas Mercer, men who'd pulled their grief so far inside it had become structural, was less useful than simply being consistently, quietly present. On Thursday of the first week, she reorganized the root cellar. It took most of the afternoon and resulted in her coming up covered in dirt with a splinter in her left palm that she had to remove herself with a needle by lamplight because she'd be damned before she'd go ask anyone for help with something so minor. On Friday, she asked Eliza to show her where the mending basket was. Eliza led her to it without being asked to explain the state it was in. A disaster of accumulated small tasks, buttons missing, hems undone, a shirt of Daniel's with a tear across the shoulder that had been there long enough the edges had frayed. "I was going to get to it," Eliza said. Her chin was up, defensive, but quiet about it. "I know," Mara said. "You've been doing too much." She picked up Daniel's shirt. "This is my job now, not yours." Something crossed Eliza's face. Relief, maybe, trying very hard to look like it wasn't. "I'm fine," the girl said. "I know you are," Mara said. "You can still be fine, and also not have to do everything yourself." Eliza said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The town, Harlow, was 14 miles, which Silas made clear early on was a trip that happened on a schedule dictated by supply needs and little else. She was not to expect it as a regular outing. She hadn't expected it at all, so that was fine. But she heard about the town before she saw it, the way you hear about a storm front, gradually, in pieces, from sources you haven't asked. The first indication was Hicks, who came out from Harlow with supplies one Tuesday morning and lingered at the wagon longer than the unloading required, making conversation with Silas in a low voice that dropped lower still when Mara came out to help carry in the flour. She caught only one phrase, which was enough. Talking about her already. Silas's jaw had tightened in a way she was beginning to recognize. "It's nobody's business," he said, clipped and final. Hicks didn't argue, but his eyes slid toward Mara with something in them she couldn't quite name. Not hostile, but not comfortable either. She carried the flour inside and said nothing. The second indication came from Eliza, who had a frankness that was both her best quality and, at times, her most complicated one. "Mrs. Bauer told her daughter that you came from nowhere," Eliza said at supper that same Tuesday, in the calm tone of someone reporting the weather. Silas looked up from his plate. "Where did you hear that?" "Hicks's daughter was at the creek, and we talked." "What else did she say?" Mara asked, keeping her voice even. "That people think it's strange, a woman coming to a ranch alone." Eliza looked at her directly. "She also said people think you're after Papa's money, but Hicks's daughter said he doesn't have any money, which seems like it ends the argument." Daniel made a noise that might have been a laugh and quickly converted it into a cough. "That's enough," Silas said, though his voice had lost some of its authority. He looked at Mara, brief and unreadable. "People talk. It doesn't mean anything." "I know it doesn't," Mara said, but she was aware as she said it that what it meant and what it cost were two separate things. What she hadn't told Silas in that kitchen on the first day was that she'd been managing other people's homes since she was 16 years old. Not as hired help, necessarily, though there had been some of that, but as the person you sent for when a household was falling apart. When Aunt Clara's husband had taken ill, it was Mara who had kept the house running. When her cousin Margaret had had the difficult birth and the difficult recovery, it was Mara who had come for 6 months and left the family functional behind her. She had a talent for seeing what a household needed, not just the surface needs, the cooking and the cleaning, but the structural needs underneath. The thing that was wrong with the foundation. At Iron Ridge, it took her 10 days to identify what that was. It was grief, of course, but grief takes different shapes in different families, and in the Mercer family it had taken the shape of silence. A silence so thorough and so practiced that it had become the family's shared language. Nobody talked about Eleanor Mercer. Nobody said her name. Her absence was maintained in the house with the same meticulous care that some families give to a presence. The empty chair at the table that nobody pushed in, the way the children's eyes moved toward the stairs, sometimes without apparent reason, Silas's habit of going still in the middle of a task as if he'd been interrupted by a thought he couldn't finish. She couldn't fix that. She knew that much. You can't hurry grief and you can't work around it. It goes on its own schedule and demands its own space. But you can, sometimes, keep the house warm enough around it that the people carrying it don't have to carry everything else at the same time. So she fixed the stove draft on day 4. She got Daniel washing his face on day 6. She taught Ruth a finger game she half remembered from her own childhood on day 8, and watched the girl's face break open with delight, which was the first time Mara had seen that happen, and which she stored carefully away somewhere and tried not to think about too directly. On day 10, she found Silas in the kitchen at 4 in the morning. She'd gotten up to bank the fire, which she'd done every night since arriving because the house cooled so fast it woke her. He was sitting at the table in the dark, not eating, not doing anything that she could see, just sitting with both hands flat on the table and his head bowed like a man who had run out of the particular energy it takes to keep going. He heard her come in, his head came up, and they looked at each other across the kitchen in the dark. She crossed to the stove without speaking and began banking the fire. She didn't ask if he was all right, because the answer was obviously no, and asking would have made him deny it, and the denial would have cost him something he couldn't afford. She put the kettle on. After a moment, she heard him exhale, a long, slow breath, like something releasing. "I keep thinking I'm managing it," he said, to the table or to himself or to her. She wasn't sure which. "And then I look at Daniel trying to put his own boots on in the morning, and He stopped, started again. "He holds his breath when he does it. Did you know that? He holds his breath like he's concentrating very hard, and it's exactly what his mother used to do when she was—" He stopped again. "Sorry." "Don't be," she said. The kettle wasn't hot yet. She stood with her back to him, giving him the privacy of not being looked at. "I just need to get through the winter," he said, quietly. The voice of a man making a promise to himself out loud, maybe for the first time. "If I can get through the winter." "You will," she said. Not to be reassuring, because she believed it. "The children are resilient, and you're more capable than you think." A pause. "You've known me 10 days. I've known enough people in my life to know the difference between someone who's struggling and someone who's failing." She turned around then, because the tea was ready and because she trusted him to handle being looked at right now. "You're struggling? That's different." He looked at her with that expression she was learning to recognize. The one that wasn't closed, but wasn't open either. The face of someone deciding whether to trust something. She poured the tea, set it in front of him. He didn't say thank you, which she'd come to understand was just Silas Mercer, rather than rudeness. She sat down across from him with her own mug, and they drank tea at 4 in the morning while the fire settled and the wind moved against the windows. It wasn't much. It was also, she suspected, more than he'd allowed himself in a long time. The days shortened. The cold had teeth now. Silas worked with a grimness that Mara had come to recognize as not cruelty, but urgency. A man who understood exactly how much needed to be done before winter locked everything down, and who was working against a clock that had no patience for anything less than everything. The cattle needed to be brought in. The hay stores needed to be assessed. 3 fence sections on the north pasture had been failing since August and would not survive a serious snowfall. She started sending food with him in the mornings. Not by announcement, she simply set a wrapped package on the porch before he came out, and he took it without comment for 3 days before he said anything. "You don't have to do that," he said one morning, briefer than usual, his breath visible in the cold. "I know," she said, But you come in at dark and you eat supper, but I can tell you haven't eaten since morning. It's not practical. He looked at the package in his hand. It's extra work. It's 20 minutes. She handed him his coat, which she'd noticed he consistently forgot. Take the coat. He took the coat with the slightly wrong-footed expression of a man who wasn't used to being looked after and didn't quite know what to do with the evidence of it. She went back inside before he could argue. Eliza, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway, said, "He doesn't know what to do when people do things for him. I noticed. He used to be different." The girl said it carefully, like she was picking her way across ice. "Before Mama died, he used to She paused. "He made her coffee every morning. That was his thing. Not because anyone asked him to. He just did." Mara kept her hands busy with the breakfast dishes. "He loved her very much." "Yes." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She loved him too. She used to say he was the least romantic man alive, and also somehow the most, which I didn't understand when she said it, but I think I understand now. Mara thought about a man who woke at 4 in the morning and sat alone in the dark and held his breath when things cost him too much. "Yes," she said. "I think I understand it too." She'd been at Iron Ridge for 3 weeks when the trouble with the town arrived in person. It came in the form of a woman named Vera Caulfield, who arrived at the front door on a Wednesday morning in a buggy driven by her husband and wearing a hat that was too good for the weather and an expression that was worse. She was the wife of the man who ran the general store in Harlow, which made her, by the laws of small towns everywhere, a person of significant informal authority. "I came to call," she said, in a tone that made clear this was not hospitality, but inspection. Mara, who had opened the door because Silas was in the barn and the children were at their lessons at the kitchen table, had precisely half a second to decide how to play this. "Please come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." Mrs. Caulfield came in and arranged herself in the parlor chair with the particular posture of a woman who is gathering evidence. She looked around the room with systematic thoroughness while Mara was in the kitchen, which Mara was fully aware of because she could see the parlor from the kitchen and had positioned herself accordingly. She brought out tea and the last of the ginger snaps she'd made 2 days ago, because there was a kind of statement in ginger snaps, a declaration that this household was managed, and she arranged them on the plate without looking like she was making a statement. "How are you finding Iron Ridge?" Mrs. Caulfield asked, in the voice of someone who already knows the answer. "Very well," Mara said. "It's a beautiful property." The woman looked at the ginger snaps as if she was deciding whether to trust them. "I knew Eleanor Mercer, you know. Wonderful woman. This family has had a very difficult time." "I know," Mara said. "I imagine the whole community has felt that." Mrs. Caulfield looked at her directly for the first time. "People have been wondering about you." "I suspected as much." "Where do you come from?" "Calverton, most recently." She sipped her tea. "Before that, several places. I was passed around a family that had difficulty keeping me in one spot." The woman set her cup down. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Whitlock. There's talk about the nature of your arrangement here. People find it irregular." "I'm a housekeeper," Mara said calmly and precisely. "Mr. Mercer needed someone to run his household. I answered an advertisement. I don't find that especially irregular." "Some do." Mrs. Caulfield's eyes were measuring. "A young woman, alone, in a widower's house. It raises questions." "Then people are welcome to come and have questions answered." Mara met the woman's gaze steadily. "I'm happy to be transparent about what I do here, which is cook and clean and look after the children. If that raises questions, I suppose that says more about the questions than about me." A long pause. Mrs. Caulfield looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had expected something different, resistance or apology, or maybe just easier guilt. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "No," Mara said, without heat. "People rarely are." The woman left 20 minutes later, and Mara stood at the window watching the buggy go and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with weather. She'd won that exchange, probably. It didn't feel like winning. That night, after the children were in bed, Silas found her in the kitchen mending one of Ruth's dresses, a small tear near the hem that she'd been meaning to get to. He came in from the barn, later than usual, smelling of cold and hay, and he poured himself a glass of water and stood leaning against the counter. "Hicks's wife mentioned Mrs. Caulfield came out today," he said. She did. How was it? Mara kept her eyes on the needle. Fine. She had questions. I answered them. He was quiet for a moment. I should have been here. It would have made it worse, actually, Mara said. Your presence would have read as defensive. This way, I handled it myself, and there's nothing for her to report back except that I served decent tea and didn't seem particularly worried. Another silence, longer. She heard him set down the glass. I'm sorry, he said, that you have to deal with that. She looked up then. He was looking at her with something genuine in his expression. Not pity, but recognition, she thought. The look of someone who knows what it costs to be judged for things you can't control. I've dealt with worse, she said. That's not the point. No, she agreed. It's not. He looked at the dress in her hands. That's Ruth's. I noticed. She's been stepping on the hem. He nodded slowly. There was something happening in his expression that she couldn't read. Not a bad something, just complicated. She likes you, he said, quietly, carefully, like it mattered. She's a good girl. She stopped sleeping in Eliza's room 3 nights ago, he said. Did you know that? She started sleeping in her own bed. She hasn't done that since... He stopped, cleared his throat. Since a while. Mara kept her hand still on the mending. I'm glad. She said she wasn't scared anymore because you checked the windows, he said. I didn't know she was scared of the windows. Mara had learned, in her second week, that Ruth had a precise and specific fear of windows at night. Not of what was outside them, but of the fact that they were dark and she couldn't see through them, which she'd said very quietly one evening when Mara had asked why she was sitting so far from them. Every night since then, before Ruth went to bed, Mara went through the girls' room and made a point of checking each window, latched, closed, curtained, and saying out loud that they were all fine. It took 4 minutes, and it cost nothing, and it had apparently given a 6-year-old her own bed back. You could do it too, Mara said. If you want. She just needs someone to check. He absorbed that. His expression shifted into something that looked, very briefly, like it hurt. I should have thought of that, he said. You're one person with a lot to carry, she said. You can't think of everything. He stood there for another moment, and then he said, Good night, Miss Whitlock, and went upstairs. She went back to the mending. The house settled around her, and the wind moved outside, and the fire kept burning, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Iron Ridge didn't feel like a place she was simply enduring. It felt, distantly and carefully, and not without some fear, like something she might stay in. December arrived without ceremony. One morning the ground was merely hard, and by the next afternoon it had locked itself solid beneath a skin of frost that didn't soften even when the sun came out. Which it did, briefly and without much conviction, before retreating again behind a wall of gray cloud that sat over the hills like something that had decided to stay. The horses stood with their heads down in the corral. The cattle in the north pasture moved slower, bunching together for warmth in ways that made Silas's jaw tighten every time he checked them. Because bunched cattle meant stressed cattle, and stressed cattle meant weight loss, and weight loss meant a worse return come spring. Mara learned these things not because Silas explained them, but because she listened. He had the habit, she'd noticed it more as the weeks passed, of talking through problems out loud while he worked, not quite to her, not quite to himself, just to the available air. She'd be scrubbing the kitchen floor, and he'd come in for water and say something like, That north fence section's not going to hold, and then pour his water and go back out, and she'd file it away. By early December, she had assembled a reasonably functional picture of the ranch's condition, which was not good. The debt was the worst of it. She hadn't been told the number directly, but she'd pieced it together from fragments, a letter from the bank in Harlow that Silas had read at the table one morning, and then folded with the particular care of someone handling something they'd rather not touch. A comment from Hicks about the price of winter grain being worse than last year. The way Silas went very still sometimes when he was looking at the small ledger book he kept in the kitchen drawer. She didn't ask. It wasn't her place and she knew it. But she started being more careful with the larder, stretching the salt pork further, making bean soup that was substantial enough to count as a meal, baking bread herself rather than buying it when the Harlow wagon came. Small things. The kind of economies that don't announce themselves but accumulate. Eliza noticed, because Eliza noticed everything. You're being careful with the flour, she said one morning, in her direct way. Good bread takes less flour than bad bread, Mara said, which was true and also not entirely what she meant. Eliza gave her the look she reserved for statements that were technically accurate and strategically incomplete. I'm 11, she said. You don't have to protect me from knowing things. Mara looked at her for a moment. The girl was standing at the kitchen table with her arms crossed and her chin at that particular angle she adopted when she felt she was being managed. There was something both admirable and exhausting about Eliza Mercer. The way she had insisted at 11 years old on being treated as someone who could handle the truth. I know you're not, Mara said, setting down the bread bowl. The ranch is stretched thin right now. I'm trying to help where I can, that's the whole of it. Does Papa know you're doing that? No, and I'd ask you not to tell him. Eliza was quiet for a moment, weighing something. He doesn't like to feel like he needs help. I know that too. You're very aware of things, Eliza said, and the way she said it made it sound less like a compliment and more like an observation she hadn't decided what to do with yet. I've had to be, Mara said simply, and picked up the bread bowl again. The girl unfolded her arms. She didn't say anything else, but she also didn't leave. She pulled out a chair and sat down and started in on the arithmetic she was supposed to be doing, right there at the kitchen table, in Mara's space. Which was, Mara was learning, Eliza's way of indicating that she'd decided something was all right. She didn't show it, but she felt something ease in her chest. Just a little. The weeks in December were hard in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not the physical work, she'd expected that, and her body adapted to it with the grim practicality of someone who'd never had the luxury of being delicate. The cold was worse than she was used to, and her hands cracked at the knuckles and didn't fully heal. And there were mornings when the water in the pitcher froze overnight and she had to break it before she could wash, but none of that broke her. She'd been colder in worse places. What she hadn't anticipated was the loneliness. Not loneliness exactly. She'd been lonely before, the whole particular flavor of being in a house full of people who didn't see you. But this was different. She was seen, at Iron Ridge. Ruth watched her with those wide, careful eyes. Daniel had started talking to her more, oblique conversations about nothing in particular that were really about things he didn't know how to say directly. Eliza argued with her, which meant she respected her. Silas acknowledged her with a consistency that was more than she'd expected when she arrived. But there was something else underneath. A particular ache she recognized from a long time ago, from being 16 and managing her aunt's house and realizing that being useful to a family and belonging to one were two entirely different things. She was useful here. She was becoming necessary. Those were not the same as belonging. She knew that. She kept it filed away in the part of herself she didn't look at too directly. Daniel found her in the barn on a Thursday afternoon when she'd gone to bring Silas a message about supper. Silas wasn't there. He was out at the north fence, which had finally demanded proper attention, and Daniel was crouched in the hay beside the gray mare's stall with a small carved figure in his hands. He didn't hear her come in, and for a moment she just saw him, 8 years old and bent over his work with that breath-holding concentration that apparently ran in the family, oblivious and intent. "What are you making?" she asked, quietly enough not to startle him. He startled anyway, looked up fast, then relaxed when he saw it was her. "A horse," he said. "Can I see?" He hesitated, which was Daniel all over, the moment of calculation before he decided whether to trust something. Then he held it out. It was rough. He was 8, and he was working with a penknife and not much guidance, but the shape of it was recognizable, and more than that, it had a quality of motion to it, the sense of something not quite still. "That's good," she said genuinely. He took it back and looked at it himself. "Papa said he'd show me how to do the legs right, but he's been too busy." She heard the thing underneath that. Not reproach exactly, just the plain fact of a child who understood that his father was overwhelmed and had decided not to add to it by asking for things. "I can ask him," she said, "when there's a good moment." Daniel shrugged, which meant yes, but he didn't want to seem like it mattered too much. "His legs are the hardest part," he said, looking at the figure. "You have to get the angle right, or they look wrong. Have you tried looking at the real horse while you work on it?" He blinked. "I didn't think of that." "Come on," she said, and moved toward the mare's stall. They spent 20 minutes crouched in the hay while Daniel studied the angles of the mare's legs with a seriousness that was, honestly, touching, and carved at his figure with small, careful strokes. And Mara watched and offered the occasional thought, and mostly just sat with him in the cold barn while the light went gold through the high window. It was nothing. It was 20 minutes. She knew, even in the middle of it, that it was the kind of moment that wouldn't look like much from the outside. It felt like something. Later that evening, she mentioned to Silas, carefully, without making it a thing, that Daniel had been working on a carving and would benefit from some guidance on technique. Silas looked at her for a moment, and she could see him absorbing this, checking himself. "I told him I'd show him," he said. "I know." He looked at the table. "There's just been a lot." "I know," she said again, not to cut him off, but to spare him the explanation. "He understands. But if there's a window, even a short one." Silas nodded. The next evening, they were at the kitchen table together for the better part of an hour. Father and son, 2 penknives, a piece of pine, and the kind of quiet conversation that happens between people who are more comfortable with their hands than with words. Mara stayed in the far end of the kitchen and didn't intrude, and pretended not to notice when Silas laughed at something Daniel said, a short, surprise sound, like he'd forgotten for a moment to hold himself carefully. Eliza noticed? Of course Eliza noticed. She caught Mara's eye across the kitchen with an expression that said, "Clearly, I see what you did there." Mara went back to the pot she was stirring. The town was another matter. Mrs. Caulfield's visit had not ended the gossip. If anything, it had given it a more specific shape. She learned about this the way she learned most things, in fragments, assembled over time. A comment from Hicks. Something Eliza reported from the creek. The way the Harlow supply wagon driver sometimes lingered a beat too long before handing over the week's goods, as if he was deciding something. The story, as best she could gather, went roughly like this. A woman had arrived from nowhere, with no references and no known history, and installed herself in a widower's house with 3 children and no chaperone and no clear explanation. And because the frontier operated on a particular economy of reputation, where what people thought of you was nearly as material as what you actually were, this was not a story that sat quietly. It moved. She had 2 choices, and she'd seen both of them play out in her life before. She could be small, visible only when useful, agreeable, apologetic for her own presence. That was the safer choice. It cost less in the short term. Or she could simply be herself, consistently and without apology, and trust that the people who mattered would eventually see it. She chose the second one, not out of bravery exactly, but because she tried the first one and it hadn't actually made anything better. It had just made her invisible. The test of that choice came in mid-December, when she went with Silas to Harlow for the first time. She hadn't asked to go. He'd mentioned he needed another pair of hands to help manage the supply load, and she'd said she could come, and he'd looked at her for a moment and then said, "All right." She suspected he knew what he was bringing her into and had decided she had the right to see it for herself. Harlow was larger than she'd pictured, a proper frontier town with the bones of ambition, a main street that had more shops than it strictly needed, a church, a school, a doctor's office with a board outside. In summer it was probably cheerful. In December, with a sharp wind off the hills, it was just functional. People looked. She'd expected that. What she hadn't quite expected was the particular quality of the looking, not hostile exactly, but weighted. The way people look at something they've already formed an opinion about and are now simply confirming. At the general store, Caulfield himself served them, a stout man with a salesman's smile that didn't reach his eyes when he looked at Mara. He was polite to Silas, the specific politeness of a creditor who is also a neighbor and has to manage both relationships simultaneously. He acknowledged Mara with a nod that was just barely adequate. She'd dealt with worse. She went through the supply list with quiet efficiency and didn't look for approval, and when Caulfield tried twice to address Silas about items she was holding rather than addressing her directly, she simply answered before Silas could, pleasantly and with complete accuracy. By the 3rd time, Caulfield had given up on that particular maneuver. Outside, loading the wagon, she became aware that a woman on the opposite side of the street was watching. She was maybe 40, wearing a good coat, and she made no effort to pretend she wasn't looking. Mara met her eyes directly. The woman held the look for a moment, then turned and went into the milliner's. Silas came up beside her with a sack of grain and heaved it into the wagon. "That was Nancy Alderman," he said, without looking at her. "Her husband is on the bank committee." "All right. She's not—" He stopped. Said another sack. "She means well, probably. They all think they do." "Most people who make other people's lives difficult do think they mean well," Mara said. It doesn't change what they do, but I try to remember it. He glanced at her sideways. There was something in his expression she'd started noticing more frequently, a kind of consideration, as if he was continuously revising an assessment. "You're very calm about it," he said. "I'm not calm about it," she said. "I've just had a lot of practice keeping that in the right place." The drive back was quiet in the way that Iron Ridge drives were quiet. Not uncomfortable, just economical. They'd passed the worst of the hills before he spoke again. "I want you to know," he said, looking at the road, "that what people say in town doesn't reflect what I think." She kept her eyes on the hills. "I know that." "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "If it did, you wouldn't have brought me along today." A pause. "That's a generous reading." "It's the accurate one." He didn't respond to that, but something in his posture shifted. A fractional relaxation, the kind you produce when you've said a thing and had it received properly. The temperature had dropped by the time they reached Iron Ridge, and the children came to the door when they heard the wagon. Ruth first, as always, quick and watchful, then Daniel with his carving still in his hand, then Eliza at a more dignified pace that fooled nobody. "Did you get the red cloth?" Eliza called. "It wasn't in stock," Silas said. "Next time." Eliza's face did the thing it did when she was deciding whether to be disappointed openly. She chose not to be. "Fine," she said, and helped with the sacks. That night, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was clean and the lamps were low, Mara sat alone at the table and let herself feel, briefly and privately, the weight of the day. The looks. The particular effort of being measured in public and choosing not to flinch. The way she'd caught her own reflection in the milliner's window as they loaded the wagon, a woman in a plain coat standing in a town that had already decided what she was, and had thought, very clearly, "I know more about myself than any of you do. That's going to have to be enough." It was going to have to be enough. She believed that. She just didn't feel it yet. She went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the wind pick up against the east wall, and the rope mattress held her, and the quilt with its faded colors was warm enough, and she thought about Ruth sleeping in her own bed now with the windows checked and the curtains drawn. She thought about Daniel's carved horse with its better legs. She thought about Eliza sitting at the kitchen table doing arithmetic in her space without asking permission. Small things. Small things that were not small if you'd gone long enough without them. She let herself feel that too. Christmas came to Iron Ridge the way it came everywhere on the frontier, practically and with minimal ceremony. Because there were animals to feed and work to do, and the holiday was a fact of the calendar rather than a pause in the rhythm of survival. Silas brought in a pine bough and set it in the parlor without comment. Mara made a fruitcake that was, by her own assessment, about 80% as good as it should have been because the dried fruit was not what she'd wanted. Ruth declared it the best thing she'd ever eaten, which was either love or diplomacy, and Mara appreciated it either way. She'd made gifts. Not purchased ones, that wasn't possible, but made. For Ruth, a cloth doll with button eyes, sewn from an old shirt that had been too worn to mend. For Daniel, a small book she'd assembled herself from paper and twine. Blank pages for sketching the things he carved or observed. For Eliza, she'd copied out 20 pages of botanical drawings from her own book, the one she'd carried since childhood, choosing the ones she thought Eliza would find most interesting, annotated with the names and uses of each plant in her careful handwriting. She hadn't planned to give Silas anything. She hadn't thought it was appropriate. But she'd found herself the week before, in the early morning before the house woke, pulling out the remainder of the red wool she'd bought in Harlow, the cloth Eliza had wanted that had been out of stock, because she'd found a bolt of it in the back of the general store and bought a length on impulse, and making him gloves. Heavy ones, better lined than his current pair, which she'd seen were wearing through at the right thumb. She set them on the table on Christmas morning without a note, before he came down. He found them when he came in for breakfast. He picked them up and looked at them without speaking, turned them over in his hands, examined the lining. "The right thumb especially," she said, from the stove. He looked at her. "Thank you, Miss Whitlock." Something in the way he said it, the weight of it, not polite but actual, made her turn back to the stove faster than she needed to. The children's gifts went over better than she'd allowed herself to hope. Ruth carried the doll to breakfast. Daniel immediately began filling pages of his new book with sketches of the horses. Eliza sat with the botanical drawings for a long time, very quiet, going through them one by one, and Mara made herself busy and didn't watch. It was only later when she was in the kitchen and heard a sound from the parlor that she identified after a moment as Eliza crying, not loudly, not dramatically, the specific quiet tears of someone who hadn't expected to be moved, that she had to stand very still at the sink for a moment and get herself together. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. "What did you give her?" "Copies of the botanical drawings from my book." She kept her voice steady. "With notes." He looked toward the parlor. "Loves botany," he said quietly. "Eleanor used to take her out in spring and teach her the plants. She hasn't, since then." He didn't finish that sentence. "I didn't know," Mara said. "No." He looked at her. "But you paid attention." She didn't know what to say to that, and he didn't wait for her to find something. He went back to the parlor, and she heard his voice, low and gentle, talking to Eliza, the voice he used when he was managing his own emotions so carefully that he had to move slowly. And she heard Eliza answer him, and she heard, distantly and through walls, the sound of a father and daughter finding their way back to each other through a grief that hadn't gone away but had maybe, possibly, shifted enough to leave room for something else. She turned back to the stove. January arrived hard. The cold that came down from the north in the first week of January was not the manageable cold of December. It was the real thing, the cold that cracks wood and freezes pipes and has a weight to it that presses down on everything. Silas was outside before dawn, and the sky was a particular shade of white-gray that he described as meaning more snow, and he was right. It started by mid-morning and didn't stop. The ranch absorbed it. The animals were mostly in. The fence sections had been dealt with, the ones that could be dealt with. But the cattle in the north pasture were a problem. They'd been meant to be moved before the serious cold hit, and one of the younger cows had gotten through a gap Silas hadn't found in time, and getting her back in the storm cost him most of an afternoon and a level of exhaustion that was becoming genuinely alarming. He came in after dark, gray-faced and moving like a man who'd used everything he had, and Mara was waiting with food that was hot and a fire that was properly banked and a basin of water she didn't explain, just set on the table with a cloth beside it. He washed his hands and ate without speaking and sat for a while afterward just breathing, and she moved around the kitchen doing the evening tasks and left him to it. Daniel had come to the kitchen doorway twice. She'd caught his eye both times and given him a small shake of her head. Not your father is not all right, but he needs quiet right now. And the boy had read it and retreated, which said something about Daniel Mercer that she was still assembling her full understanding of. "The finances," Silas said, finally, when the kitchen had been quiet for a while. His voice was flat with tiredness. "The bank letter I got before Christmas." She kept working. "You don't have to tell me." "I know I don't." He turned the mug in his hands. "I have until April to bring the note current, the interest plus 3 months principal." He named a number. "If I can't do that, they have the right to call the whole note due." She had known, roughly, that it was bad. She had not known the number. "Can you?" she asked. "If we have a decent calf crop and the price holds, I'll be close." He paused. "If the winter keeps hitting this hard and I lose animals—" He didn't finish it. She set down what she was doing and turned around. He was looking at the table with the expression she'd seen that first night at 4 a.m, the face of a man who'd reached the edge of what he could hold. "The calf crop," she said. "That's spring. February and March, mostly." "All right." She sat down across from him, which she didn't usually do at this hour, but this seemed like a moment that called for it. "Then we hold on until February. We cut what we can. We don't lose the animals we have." She paused. "I can help in ways you might not have considered." He looked up. "You're already doing more than—" "I can do more." She kept her voice practical because practical was what he could hear right now. Not anything softer. "I managed the finances for 2 households before I came here. Not the same scale, but the same principle. Let me look at the ledger, see if there's anything I can find." He sat very still, and she could see the conflict in him. The particular stubbornness of a man who'd been raised to manage his own affairs and found it almost physically difficult to accept help in this specific way, in the numbers, in the thing he felt most responsible for. "It's not charity," she said. "It's just a second pair of eyes." A long pause. Then he got up and went to the drawer and took out the ledger and set it on the table between them. "All right," he said. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, going through it together. He explained. She asked questions. They found 3 places where there was small room to adjust. Nothing dramatic, nothing that solved the problem, but enough to ease the pressure by a fraction. She did not pretend it was more than it was, and he didn't ask her to. What she found was enough to be worth finding, and when they were done, he closed the ledger and sat back and looked at her with an expression that was tired and complicated and grateful in a way he clearly didn't have easy words for. "You're good at that," he said. "I've had to be." He nodded slowly. There was a pause that had a different quality to it than the usual pauses. Fuller, somehow. Less absence and more the sense of something present between them that hadn't been named yet. "Why did you come here?" he asked. Not unkindly, just directly, the way he asked everything. To Iron Ridge, there must have been other positions. She considered the question. She could give him the practical answer, that Iron Ridge had been what was available, that she'd needed work, and this had been work. All of that was true. "I needed somewhere that needed something from me that I actually had to give," she said, which was also true and more of it. Not just endurance or patience, something real. He looked at her for a long moment. "And is it?" She thought of Ruth and the windows, Daniel and the carved horse, Eliza and the botanical drawings. The ledger open between them. "Yes," she said. "It is." He didn't respond right away, but when he finally pushed back from the table and said goodnight, there was something different in how he moved, not lighter exactly, but less alone in his weight. She sat at the table after he'd gone, with the lamp burning low, and listened to the wind against the walls and the snow still coming down outside, and thought about belonging, what it meant and what it cost, and what it occasionally, unexpectedly, felt like to be on the edge of it. The town kept talking. She knew this from Eliza, from Hicks, from the angle of people's eyes in Harlow when she went again in late January. The story had evolved, the way stories do when they're fed by people who don't have enough information and fill the gaps with what they expect. She was after the ranch. She was after the man. She was unsuitable. She was calculating. None of it was true, and all of it was outside her control. And some mornings it sat on her like an actual weight. The knowledge that somewhere in Harlow, people were talking about who she was with complete confidence and complete wrongness. She kept going. She kept the house. She kept the children fed and warm and as steady as she could manage, which was not perfect. There were still mornings when Daniel came to breakfast with red eyes and wouldn't say why. Still evenings when Eliza's composure cracked along invisible seams and she became suddenly and briefly 11 years old in the most vulnerable sense of it. Mara had learned to see it coming and to make space for it without making it a scene, which was the thing they needed most. What she couldn't make space for was the day Agnes Holloway came to the ranch. Agnes was Mrs. Caulfield's closest friend, and by all accounts, the more efficient vehicle of the two for moving information through Harlow. She came in early February ostensibly to return a dish she'd borrowed from the Mercers, from Eleanor Mercer, which meant it had been a year and 4 months since she could have returned it, a fact she did not acknowledge. And she came when Silas was not home and the children were at their lessons. She was a woman who'd perfected the art of the concerned tone, which is to say she delivered every pointed thing she had to say in a voice of such gentle worry that it was very difficult to object to directly. "I just think," she said, sitting in the parlor with her hands folded, "about those children, what they're being shown." Mara sat across from her with tea she had not particularly wanted to make. "And what are they being shown? That this is ordinary. A young woman and a man in this situation, unchaperoned, no family connection." She paused meaningfully. "Children absorb these things. They're absorbing a clean house and regular meals," Mara said, "and I think they're managing all right." Agnes's smile didn't change. "I'm sure you mean well." "I do," Mara said, "and I'm sure you do too." A small silence. Agnes looked around the room with the particular gaze of someone looking for confirmation of what they already believe. "Eleanor was such a careful woman," she said. "She cared very much about what this family represented in the community." Mara set her cup down. She did it quietly, deliberately, the way you set something down when you're deciding how much to say. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, in a voice that was completely even, "Eleanor Mercer's children are asleep in this house, and her husband is trying to hold this ranch together through the hardest winter in 3 years. I'm here to help him do that. Everything I do in this house is in service of what she built. the family she made, the home she kept. I don't know what you came here expecting to find, but that's what I can tell you is here. Agnes Holloway looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had gone, very slightly, uncertain. She left not long after. Mara went back to the kitchen and stood at the window and watched the buggy go down the track, and she felt something cold and clear settle in her chest. Not anger exactly, more like resolution. She had been patient. She had been quiet. She had absorbed the looks and the words and the weight of being talked about, and she would keep absorbing it because it was not the point. It was not what mattered. What mattered was the house behind her and the children in it, and the man who was somewhere out in the cold working to keep it all from collapsing. That was the whole of it. She turned back to the kitchen. The bread needed turning. She turned it. The bread she turned that afternoon came out right, which was something. Small victories were the only kind February offered. The calf crop started in the second week of the month, and for a while it seemed like the answer to the ledger problem might actually arrive on schedule. Silas was in the barn at all hours, sleeping there some nights, coming in only to eat and occasionally to wash. And the numbers were moving in the right direction. 4 calves in the first week, healthy ones. 3 more the following Monday. He came to supper on Tuesday of that week looking like a man who had not slept properly in 6 days, which was accurate, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there in January. Not optimism exactly, more like the specific alertness of someone who can see the thing they've been fighting toward and has decided it's worth the last of what they have. 7 so far, he told the table, not to anyone in particular. 7, Daniel repeated with the gravity of someone who understood what that meant without fully understanding what that meant. We need 14 to make the spring number work, Silas said. Could still get there. Eliza looked up from her plate. And if we do? Then we make the bank payment. Then we have a conversation with them about restructuring the rest. He said it in the careful voice of a man reporting facts rather than allowing himself to hope, because hope in this particular context felt like a thing that could be broken. Mara set the bread basket on the table and sat down and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to add, and sometimes the right thing was just to be present in the room while someone else worked through what was real. Ruth, who had been listening with wide eyes and the appearance of someone who understood about half of what was being said, reached across the table and patted her father's hand with the solemnity of a 6-year-old who has decided to offer comfort without knowing exactly what comfort looks like. Silas looked at his daughter's small hand on his, and something in his face shifted in the way it only shifted for Ruth, the place where the exhaustion gave way, briefly, to something unguarded. "Thank you, Bug," he said quietly. Ruth withdrew her hand and went back to her supper looking satisfied. Those good days lasted exactly 11 days. On a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of February, she woke to the sound of wind so violent that it had worked its way through the gap at the east window she'd been meaning to pack with rags. And the cold in the room was a different kind of cold than usual, the active, attacking kind, the kind that finds you even under blankets. She dressed fast, moving with the quick efficiency she'd developed in rooms where temperature was never guaranteed, and got the kitchen fire going before the children came down. Silas was already gone. She hadn't heard him leave, which meant he'd been up before 4, which meant something was wrong in the barn. She got the children their breakfast and kept her voice easy and her movements normal, because Eliza was watching her the way she always watched when she was trying to determine whether to be afraid, and Mara had learned that Eliza took her cues from whoever was steadiest in the room. Daniel ate with one eye on the window. "It's going to be bad today," he said. "Probably," Mara agreed. "Papa was out early." "He was. Is the hurt okay?" "I'm sure he's handling it." She set more bread on the table. "Eat." He ate, but his jaw had the set to it that she recognized as the Mercer version of worry, which was to go very quiet and very controlled, and she filed that away. The storm that came down that day was the kind that the frontier generates once or twice a winter to remind everyone what it's actually capable of. A deep, cold system out of the northwest that dropped the temperature 15 degrees in 4 hours and brought snow horizontally. The barn was 40 feet from the back door, and by noon you could barely see it. Silas came in twice. Once for rope, once for the emergency grain store that was kept in the mudroom, and both times he was moving with the controlled urgency of a man managing a crisis at a specific and contained distance from panic. She kept the kitchen running, food ready, water hot, fire solid. It was late afternoon, the light going gray-white outside the windows, when she heard it. Not the storm. She'd been hearing the storm for hours. This was something inside the house, a sound from upstairs that her body identified before her mind did, the particular high note of a child in distress. She was up the stairs before she'd made a conscious decision to go. Daniel was in the hallway outside his room, and the expression on his face was the one she'd never seen before on him. Not his careful quiet, not his working through its silence, but something stripped and open and very young. "Something's wrong with Ruth," he said. "She was fine at supper, and then she wasn't, and she can't stop shaking." Ruth was in her bed. She was conscious, her eyes were open, but they were too bright, the brightness that has nothing to do with alertness and everything to do with fever. And she was shaking in a way that was not cold but the body's own emergency response. And when Mara put her hand to the girl's forehead, she pulled it back with the particular controlled calm of someone who has just confirmed something serious. The fever was high enough that Mara's stomach dropped once, hard, and then she locked that down and started moving. "Daniel," she said, her voice even. "Go get Eliza and bring her here, then go to the barn and get your father. Don't run in the storm. Keep the rope line if he's put one up. Go slow. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, already moving. She went to the washroom for the basin and the clean cloth she'd restocked last week, one of those small preparatory things she'd done without knowing it mattered. And she came back to Ruth and started cooling the fever with damp cloths the way she'd learned in her aunt's house when a child who'd recovered was not the thing you assumed but the thing you worked toward. "Mara," Ruth said in a voice that was thin and too small. "I'm here," she said. "I'm right here. You're going to be okay." She said it with complete steadiness and did not let herself think about whether it was certain, because certainty was not available and the child did not need her uncertainty. The child needed her presence and her hands and the cool cloth and the sound of her voice. Eliza appeared in the doorway. She took in the scene and went white, and for a moment she was not the composed, managing 11-year-old, but just a girl looking at her sick little sister, and the fear on her face was very naked. "Eliza," Mara said, "come here and hold her hand, talk to her, tell her about the calves, whatever you know. She likes hearing about them." Eliza came. She sat on the edge of the bed and took Ruth's hand and started talking, low, steady, about the calves, about the gray one with the uneven patch, about spring. And Mara moved around her, doing what she was doing, and the room held. Silas came up the stairs 4 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him, his boots on the stairs, fast, the specific weight of someone who's been told something and is running toward it with all the fear he hasn't had time to process. He came through the doorway and stopped when he saw Ruth, and the look on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, stripped of everything, every wall and every managed surface. Just raw fear, undisguised. "How bad?" he said to Mara. Direct, clipped, the voice of someone who needs information and has no room for anything else. "Fever's high," she said. "Started fast. No other symptoms I can see yet." She kept her voice clinical, not to be cold, but because clinical was what he could use right now. "I need you to think. Is there a doctor in Harlow? Harlow is 14 miles in this storm." His jaw was set. "Calloway? There's a man named Calloway. He came last spring when Daniel had the ear infection. He's 3 miles, not 14. Can you get there?" He was already calculating it. She could see him doing it, the math of storm and distance and what was at stake. With the big roan, keeping to the tree line, "Then go," she said. "I'll stay with her." He looked at her. In that moment, with Ruth's breathing audible between them and the storm against the windows and Eliza's voice still going low and steady about the gray calf. In that moment, something passed between them that was not a conversation, but was clearer than most conversations. She saw him see her, not the housekeeper, not the woman the town had decided about, not the stranger who'd arrived with one bag in November, but whatever she actually was, which was the person standing between his daughter and what he feared most. He looked at Ruth. He put his hand to her face, gentle, the way he was only with the children, and said something too quiet for Mara to hear. Then he stood and looked at Mara again. "Keep the fever down," he said. "I know," she said. If it gets worse." "Go," she said. "I have her." He went. She heard him on the stairs, then the back door, then nothing but wind. The next 3 hours were the longest she'd spent at Iron Ridge, and Iron Ridge had already given her some long hours. Ruth's fever climbed before it broke, which was what fevers did, and which she knew intellectually, and which was considerably harder to manage emotionally when the person burning was 6 years old and asking for her father in a voice gone small and strange with heat. Mara kept the cloths cool and kept changing them and kept talking. Not about anything consequential, just words. A steady stream of them. The names of plants from the botanical book, the colors of the horses in the corral, the recipe for the fruitcake that had been 80% of what it should have been. She talked because silence in a sick room has a quality that feeds fear, and Ruth needed to hear a voice more than she needed any particular content. Eliza held Ruth's hand and stopped talking once, and Mara said quietly, "Keep going," and Eliza started again. They were two people in a room doing the only things available to them, which was not enough and was also everything. Daniel appeared in the doorway twice. She sent him for more water once and let him stay the second time, crouched in the corner of the room with his hands between his knees and his carved horse in one fist, and she didn't tell him to leave because she understood that what he needed was to be close to his sister, and there was no reason to take that from him. The fever reached its worst around 2 hours in. Ruth was not unconscious, but she was not quite present either, eyes open and too bright, murmuring things that didn't quite form sentences. Mara's hand stayed steady. She did not know how. Some deep and practical part of her had taken over and was just doing the work. And the rest of her was somewhere slightly removed, watching and not thinking too hard about outcomes. She made herself count things instead. The cloths changed. 1, 2, 3. The minutes on the clock, 1/4 hour, then half, then 3/4. The words she was saying, rivers she'd read about, cities she'd never been to, the names of plants she could still recite from memory because she'd been reading that book since she was 12 years old. Eliza, at some point in the second hour, said, "You're not scared?" Mara kept changing the cloth. "I'm scared," she said. "I'm just not stopping." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you do? When you're scared?" "It's what I've learned to do." The girl absorbed that, holding her sister's hand, and Mara felt Eliza adjusting something internally, filing this away the way she filed everything, into whatever model she was building of how a person was supposed to work. The fever broke in the third hour. It was not dramatic. It was just that Ruth's skin, which had been radiating heat, became merely warm, and her breathing steadied from its shallow pace, and the brightness in her eyes softened into something closer to normal tiredness, and she looked at Mara with a face that was exhausted and confused and present. "My head hurts," she said. "I know," Mara said. "That's okay. That's going to get better." "Where's Papa?" "He went to get the doctor. He'll be back soon." Ruth's eyes drifted toward the window where the storm was still loud and still going. "It's very bad outside," she said. "It is," Mara agreed. "Your Papa knows how to handle it." "He holds his breath," Ruth said, with the dreamy incoherence of someone still partly in fever. "When he's scared. Like Daniel." "I know," Mara said softly. Ruth closed her eyes. Mara kept the cloth on her forehead and sat very still and let herself breathe out slowly. Eliza made a sound, one sharp, quiet sound, bitten off immediately, and Mara reached across without looking and put her hand briefly over the girl's. Eliza gripped it hard for 2 seconds, and then let go. "She's going to be okay," Eliza said, not asking, deciding. "She's going to be okay," Mara agreed. Daniel unfolded himself from the corner and came to the foot of the bed, and looked at his sister for a long moment with an expression of such uncomplicated relief that Mara had to look away. "She looks better," he said. "She does." "I'm hungry," he said, because he was 8 years old and the crisis had passed and his body had moved on to the next concern. She almost laughed. It came out as something softer. "There's bread in the kitchen. Don't touch the stew. It's for when your father gets back." He went. Eliza stayed, still holding Ruth's hand, and Mara stayed too, and the room was quiet except for Ruth's steadier breathing and the storm pressing against the windows, and the fire she'd banked an hour ago still doing its work. Silas came back with Calloway just before 9 o'clock at night. Calloway was a compact, unhurried man in his 50s who examined Ruth with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen enough to know that thoroughness was the only real insurance available. He asked Mara what she'd done, and she told him, and he listened and nodded and said, "You did right," in the tone of someone who doesn't offer that lightly. Fever broke on its own, he asked. About 2 hours ago. And she's been responsive since? Yes, tired, but present. He looked at Ruth, who was asleep now, genuinely asleep rather than fever unconscious, which was a distinction that mattered enormously. Viral, I think. Not the lungs. That's the worry with these fast fevers in children. I want to check back in 2 days, but if she keeps improving through tomorrow, she'll be all right. He looked at Mara directly. You kept the fever from going higher. That was the critical thing. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice right at that moment. Calloway packed his bag and went downstairs with Silas, and she heard their voices low in the kitchen, and she sat in Ruth's room in the chair she'd pulled close to the bed and looked at the girl sleeping and felt, for the first time since she'd come up those stairs, the full weight of the last several hours arriving all at once. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that distantly, looking at them. They'd been steady for 3 hours, and now they were shaking, which was apparently the order her body had decided to do things in. She pressed them together in her lap and breathed. She heard Calloway leave. She heard Silas on the stairs. He came into the room quietly, the way you move in a room where someone is sleeping. He looked at Ruth for a long moment, his daughter, breathing normally, her face relaxed, the crisis on the far side of her now, and the expression on his face was something she felt she shouldn't be watching, but couldn't help it. It was too open, too much of him in it. He pulled his gaze away and looked at Mara and saw her hands. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside hers and reached over and put both his hands around hers, the way you'd hold something you needed to stop from shaking. His hands were cold from outside and still very large, and he held hers without any preamble, without asking, without saying anything at all. She should have pulled away. She knew that. There was a long list of very practical reasons why. She didn't pull away. She's okay, Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I know. He was looking at his daughter. Calloway told me. The fever broke before you got back. I should tell you more of what I did in case... In a minute, he said quietly. Just in a minute. She stopped talking. They sat in the chair side by side in Ruth's room with the lamp burning low and the storm still going outside, though quieter now, the worst of it passing, and his hands around hers still, steadying something in both of them. After a while, Ruth made a small sound in her sleep. Not distress, just the sound of someone sleeping deeply. And they both looked at her. And then Silas exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to go all the way to his bones. She asked for me, Mara said quietly, while the fever was high. I know, Eliza told me. He paused. She also said you didn't stop the whole time. There wasn't a reason to stop. Mara. He said her name, her actual name, not Miss Whitlock, the first time she realized he had ever said it, and there was something in it she couldn't entirely process. He turned his head and looked at her directly. I don't have the words for this. You don't need to have them, she said. I do, actually. He seemed to be choosing carefully, the way he did everything, deliberate, not given to waste. I've been watching you in this house for 3 months. I know that it's been hard, what people say. I know I've been... He stopped, tried again. I'm not easy to be around, I know that. You're not so bad, she said, which was honest if incomplete. Something moved at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile. I owe you more than I can... He stopped again. Eleanor used to say I was better at doing things than saying them. She wasn't wrong. I know, Mara said. I've noticed. He looked at her for a moment longer, and she saw it happen. The thing she'd been watching happen incrementally for 3 months. The slow erosion of whatever he'd built between himself and the world since Eleanor died. And the beginning of something tentative and unannounced in its place. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She understood him well enough by now to know that him sitting there at all was the thing. That him saying her name was the thing. That him holding her hand still in his was more than she'd expected to receive from this man, and more than she'd known she needed until right now. They stayed until they were both sure Ruth was truly settled, and then they went downstairs separately, as was right. And he made coffee because apparently that was what he did when he didn't know what else to do. And she sat at the kitchen table and drank it even though it was late. And they didn't talk very much, but the silence was different than it had been. Eliza and Daniel had both fallen asleep on the parlor floor at some point during the wait, which Mara discovered when she went to check. Daniel had the carved horse still in his fist. Eliza had apparently been reading and fallen asleep mid-page. She stood in the doorway looking at them for a moment. Silas appeared behind her. She felt rather than heard him stop. "Don't wake them," she said softly. "No," he agreed. She got blankets, and they covered the children without waking them, each taking a side, moving quietly around each other in the small space with the practiced ease of people who have learned how to share a house. Silas tucked the blanket around Eliza's shoulders with a carefulness so private it was almost painful to see, and Daniel shifted without waking and muttered something unintelligible that might have been a word or might have just been sleep. They straightened up on opposite sides of the room and looked at the children for a moment, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying, but there was also something there, in the room, in the space between them. Something that had not been there before tonight, built from the hours in Ruth's room and his hands around hers and the single syllable of her name in his voice. She could feel it as clearly as she could feel the cold still coming off his coat. She could feel it, and it frightened her because she knew what it meant, and she knew how much there was to lose if it went wrong, and she had very little left that she could afford to lose. She went to her room. She did not think about it for the remainder of the night. She mostly succeeded. The next morning, Ruth woke up asking for biscuits, which Calloway, when Silas reached him by way of Hicks's son, said was a very good sign. She was pale and tired and wanted to stay in bed, which was allowed, and Mara brought her biscuits and the botanical book, the original, not the copies, and sat with her for an hour while she looked at the pressed illustrations with the careful wonder of a child encountering something preserved. "This one's pretty," Ruth said, pointing to a pressed violet, still faintly purple after years. "That's my favorite too," Mara said. Ruth looked at her. "Why?" "Because it's small, and it grows in places where it's not supposed to, and it survives anyway." She paused. "I've always found that encouraging." Ruth considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Like us," she said. Mara looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Papa says we're tough," Ruth said simply. "He says Mercer people grow in places where they're not supposed to." She touched the pressed violet gently. "I think you're tough, too." Mara looked at the violet in the book, the small, stubborn thing that had survived long enough to be pressed between pages and carried across the frontier by a girl who had needed to believe in something that persisted. "Thank you, Ruth," she said. The girl had already moved on to the next page. Outside, the storm was finally done. The sky had gone a pale, clean blue, the kind that only comes after serious weather has passed, emptied of everything and starting over. The snow lay deep and still over Iron Ridge, and the barn and the house and the hills beyond were quiet in it. Mara stood at the window of Ruth's room and looked out at it and thought about tough things that grew in the wrong places. The winter wasn't over, but the worst of it, she thought, the very worst of it, might be behind them now. Ruth recovered in the slow, uneven way that children do. 2 good days followed by 1 bad one, then 3 good ones. Then a morning where she woke with a low fever that scared everyone and broke by noon without drama. By the end of the first week of March, she was back at the kitchen table for meals, still pale, but eating properly. And by the second week, she had resumed following Mara around the house with her previous dedication, which Mara chose to read as the most reliable indicator of genuine recovery. The ranch, meanwhile, had found its footing. The final calf count came to 16, 2 more than Silas had projected as his best-case number. And he came in from the barn on the morning of the count with mud on his boots, and something in his face that was not quite the unburdened expression of a man whose problems were solved, but was the specific look of someone who can see, clearly for the first time in months, that they are not going to lose. He sat down at the kitchen table and wrote in the ledger for a long time, and when he closed it, he set both hands flat on the cover and just breathed. Mara set coffee in front of him and didn't say anything. 16, he said. I heard, she said. We make the payment. We make it with enough left to have a conversation with the bank about the rest of the note. He looked at the ledger. It's not over, but it's... He stopped. It's not over, she agreed. But you can see the other side of it now. He looked up at her. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. She went back to the stove. The thing between them, the thing that had arrived in Ruth's room during the storm and had no proper name yet, and possibly wasn't ready for one, had not gone away. It had not announced itself further either. It existed in the space between them the way certain weather exists before it commits to being anything, present, felt, unresolved. She was careful with it, more careful than she'd ever been with anything, probably, because she understood what was at stake in a way she hadn't understood about other things. If she was wrong about what she thought she'd seen in him, if she'd mistaken exhaustion and gratitude for something deeper, then she would have to leave, and leaving Iron Ridge now would cost her something she wasn't sure she'd recover from quickly. So she kept her distance, and she kept her hands busy, and she kept her heart in the place she'd learned to keep it, which was somewhere behind practicality, behind the work, behind the daily business of the house that needed running. It was Eliza who complicated this strategy, because Eliza had apparently decided, quietly, unilaterally, with the particular conviction of an 11-year-old who has made up her mind, that patience was a virtue that had been given sufficient time. "He looks at you when you're not watching," Eliza said one afternoon in the matter-of-fact tone she used for all her most consequential observations. They were in the parlor. Mara was mending. Again, there was always mending. And Eliza was supposedly reading, but had been looking at the same page for 20 minutes. "Eliza," Mara said, "I'm just telling you what I see. What you see and what it means are two different things." "Sometimes," Eliza said. "Not always." She turned the page she hadn't actually read. "He's been different since the night Ruth was sick. Since he came back and you were in her room." She paused. "I was watching. I'm sorry, I know I wasn't supposed to be in the hall, but I was." Mara kept her eyes on the mending. Her hands were steady, which she considered an achievement. "And what did you see?" "He held your hands," Eliza said simply. The needle went through the fabric twice before Mara answered. It had been a frightening night." "Yes," said Eliza. "I know what a frightening night looks like in this house. I've seen a few of them." She looked at Mara directly, and there was something in her eyes that was older than 11 and had earned the right to be. "He didn't hold Mrs. Holt's hands, or Miss Pierce's." "I'm not Mrs. Holt or Miss Pierce." "No," Eliza said. "You're not." A pause. Outside, Daniel was somewhere in the yard with the horses, which Silas had started letting him handle under supervision. They could hear him occasionally, his voice carrying across the cold air. "What is it you're trying to say?" Mara asked. Eliza put her book down entirely. "I'm trying to say that I'm 11, not stupid, and I'm trying to say—" She stopped, and for a moment she was just a girl working out how to say something she'd rehearsed and found harder than expected. "When Mama died, I thought the house was done, like the story of it was just finished, and then you came. And it wasn't finished, it was just—" Another pause. "It was just stopped for a while." Mara set the mending down in her lap. "I'm not trying to replace your mother," she said carefully. "I want you to know that. Whatever this is or isn't, that's not what it is." "I know that." Eliza's voice was steady in the way it was steady when she was working hard to keep it that way. "Mama was Mama. That's a separate thing." She looked at the window. "But this house needs someone who stays, who chooses it. And I think you already have, even if nobody's said it out loud yet." Mara looked at this child who had been managing her own grief for 14 months, while simultaneously managing her younger siblings and accounting for her father's incapacity with a practicality that should have been beyond her years and somehow wasn't. And she felt something in her chest that was complicated and large and didn't have a simple name. "You're remarkable, you know," Mara said quietly. Eliza looked back at her. "Mama said I was exhausting." Both things can be true. The girl's composure cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, and then held. "Yes," she said, and picked up her book again. "I think that's right." The subject was closed, but it had been opened, and both of them knew it. March in Harlow had a particular personality that differed from March in most places, which was that it offered no guarantee of being March in any reliable sense. The temperature could drop back into January territory without warning, and twice in the first 2 weeks it did exactly that, a false warmth followed by a reminder that the frontier set its own schedule. On the third Saturday of the month, Silas went to Harlow for the bank meeting. He'd prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, methodically, without discussion of the emotion underneath the method. He'd gone over the numbers with Mara 3 times the week before, working through the ledger at the kitchen table late at night, and she'd helped him arrange the presentation of the argument. Not the numbers themselves, which were what they were, but the order in which to present them, the way to frame the calf count as evidence of stability rather than luck, the approach to take with the loan officer, who Mara had assessed from Silas's description as a man who respected specificity over general confidence. "You know things," he'd said the last night they worked on it, looking at her with that expression she'd come to recognize as him updating his understanding of something. "I've had to," she said, for what felt like the 100th time. It was the truest short answer she had. He'd left before 7, and she'd spent the day with the ordinary work of the house, which was its own kind of useful anxiety management. By mid-afternoon, she was cleaning the upstairs rooms, a thorough cleaning, the kind she did when she needed her hands doing something repetitive, when Daniel appeared in the hallway. "When's Papa coming back?" he asked. "Before supper," she said. "Probably." "Is the bank meeting bad?" She wrung out the mop cloth. "It's important. That's not the same as bad." Daniel leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed, the posture that meant he was working toward something by degrees. "If the bank says no," he said, "what happens to the ranch?" She looked at him. He was looking at the floor, which was how he asked the things he actually wanted to know. 8 years old and carrying the weight of this question like it was his to carry. "Your father is going to make a strong case," she said. "And I think the bank will listen." She paused. "But even if things were harder than that, this family has handled hard things before. It would be different hard, but you'd handle it the same way." "How's that?" "Together," she said. "One thing at a time." He absorbed this. His jaw did the Mercer thing, the settling, the accepting. "Okay," he said, and went back downstairs. She stood in the hallway for a moment after he left, mop in hand, and thought about what she'd just said. Together. She'd said it without thinking, the way you say things that have become true before you've noticed them becoming anything. Silas came back at 4:30, which was before supper and later than she'd been hoping. She heard the wagon and was in the kitchen when he came through the back door, and she made herself not look up immediately. She kept her hands on the pot she was stirring and let him come in and let him sit down, because she knew him well enough to know that he needed a moment before he said anything significant. He pulled out a chair. He sat. He set his hat on the table. She turned around. His face was tired. That was the first thing. The second thing was that it was not the face of someone carrying catastrophe. "They agreed to restructure," he said. 14 months, new terms. Higher monthly, but it gives us the time." He pressed his hand against the table briefly, like he was checking it was solid. "We have to hit the calf numbers again next spring. If we do that, we're out from under it." "You'll hit them," she said. He looked at her. "You say that like you know. You got 16 this year when you needed 14. You'll know better what you're doing next time." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the way he had, that long, considering look. "They said something else," he said. His voice changed register, going slightly careful. "At the bank." She kept her face neutral. "What was that?" "Alderman, the loan officer, he made a comment about the ranch's situation, about the arrangement here." He was choosing words. He was polite about it, but the implication was that a widower with a female employee, no family connection, in a remote... He stopped. He said it complicated the picture they had of the ranch's stability. She set the spoon down on the counter. Her hands were still. "I see." "He wasn't wrong that people have been talking," Silas said. "He was wrong that it matters, but he wasn't wrong that it exists." "What are you saying?" she asked. She kept her voice even. She was very good at keeping her voice even when she was afraid. He looked at her for a long time. "I'm saying that it occurred to me on the drive back that there's a simple solution to the problem of what people are saying." He paused. "And I've been sitting with that for 4 hours now." The kitchen was very quiet. "Silas," she said carefully, "I'm not asking out of practicality," he said, and his voice had changed again. It had lost its management, the careful assembly. It was just him, talking. I need you to understand that. This isn't about the bank or what Alderman said or what the town thinks." He looked at her with an expression that was, for this man, this particular man who had spent 14 months holding everything inside very carefully extraordinarily open. I'm asking because you held my daughter's hands for 3 hours in a February storm while I was out in it, and you didn't stop. And when I came back, you were the one thing in that room that I... He stopped, tried again. Because you've been in this house for 4 months, and every single time I've come in from the barn, the house has been... It's been a house. Not a place I'm surviving. A house. Another stop. I'm not saying this right. You're saying it fine, she said quietly. I should have... He pushed back from the table slightly, an involuntary movement, like the emotion was taking up physical space and he needed room for it. I don't want you to leave. That's the center of it. I haven't wanted you to leave since January, maybe before. And I know it's more complicated than a question, and you have every right to say no, and I won't. It won't change anything. Your position here, that's not... Silas, she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who was terrible at talking about things that mattered and had been trying to say this anyway, who had just spent 4 hours in a wagon working up to something that clearly cost him a great deal, who made coffee when he didn't know what else to do and held her hands when she was shaking and said her name once in a sick room and had been saying it ever since in every other way except out loud. Ask me properly, she said. Her voice was steady. Her heart was not. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, close, closer than they'd been except for the night in Ruth's room, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her then. No walls, no management, just him. Mara, he said, will you marry me? It wasn't a smooth question. It came out slightly wrong at the end, the cadence off, the way things come out when you've planned them and then abandoned the plan and just said the actual words. She loved that about it. She loved that he hadn't managed it into something polished. Yes, she said. I will. He exhaled, one long, slow breath, and put his hand to her face, the way he'd touched Ruth's during the fever, with that same extraordinary gentleness. His palm was rough from the work and warm despite the cold he'd come in from, and she pressed her face briefly against it and closed her eyes. They stayed like that for a moment. Just a moment. Then the back door opened and Daniel came in with his boots muddy and said, Is supper ready? I'm starving, and stopped dead when he saw them. The 3 seconds that followed were, Mara thought, among the more comedic of her recent memory. Daniel stared. Mara stepped back. Silas turned around with an expression of such profound disrupted dignity that she had to look at the pot on the stove to keep from laughing. Daniel, Silas said in his father voice. Sorry, Daniel said, not sounding it, his eyes moving between them. Sorry, is supper. Almost, Mara said. Daniel stood there for another moment with the wide-awake eyes of a child who has walked into something he doesn't fully understand but recognizes as significant. Then something moved in his expression, slow, uncertain, but moving in the right direction, and he said, Okay, and went to the sink to wash his hands. That evening, after supper, Silas told the children. He did it at the table, which was where the Mercer family conducted its significant business. She'd noticed that, how the table served as the place for things that needed to be said out loud. He told them plainly, without decoration. He'd asked Mara to marry him, and she'd said yes, and if they had questions or thoughts, he wanted to hear them. The table was quiet for a moment. Ruth said, Does that mean Mara stays? Yes, Silas said. That's what it means. Ruth put both hands flat on the table and looked at Mara with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated relief that it bypassed every complicated thing Mara was feeling and just landed directly in her chest. Good, Ruth said with finality, and went back to her supper. Daniel looked at his plate for a moment, and then looked at Mara sideways. You'll still help with the carving? He asked. Of course, she said. He nodded. Apparently that settled it. Eliza said nothing for a longer moment. She was looking at the table with her hands in her lap, and Mara could not read her expression, which was unusual. Then she looked up and her eyes were bright in a way that was not crying but was related to it. Okay, Eliza said. Her voice was steady. I think that's right. Mara held her gaze. Are you sure? Eliza looked at her directly, this girl who had been managing her family's grief with one hand and her own with the other for over a year, who had sat in Ruth's room and talked about calves while her sister burned with fever, who had said the story wasn't finished, it was just stopped. "Yes," she said, "I'm sure." The news reached Harlow before Silas formally announced anything, which was not surprising and was, honestly, fine. The Frontier's communication network had never required official channels. By the time he made the drive to town the following Saturday to speak to Reverend Marsh about a date, the general shape of it was already known, which meant that the general shape of the town's response was also already forming. It was not uniformly positive. She had expected that. She had expected Agnes Holloway's version of it, the concerned tone, the careful implication. But what she had not expected was that it would arrive at Iron Ridge in person, and that it would arrive while Silas was not home. There were 3 of them this time. Agnes Holloway, a woman named Ida Crane, who sat on the church auxiliary, and Mrs. Caulfield herself, completing what Mara recognized as the essential committee. They came in a wagon on a Tuesday morning with the stated purpose of welcoming her to the community, which she might have found more persuasive if they hadn't arranged themselves on the parlor furniture with the specific geometry of people preparing for something. She served them tea. She was not going to stop serving people tea because they meant her harm. That felt like a line she preferred to hold. "We want to be supportive," Agnes began. "I appreciate that," Mara said. "It's just—" Agnes looked at the other 2, a sideways check, then back. "There are people in town who feel that this has all moved rather quickly, that Silas may not be in the right state of mind to be making this kind of decision." "And what state of mind would that be?" Mara asked. "He's still grieving," Ida Crane said gently. She was softer than the other 2, which made her the more dangerous one. Soft people are harder to argue with. "Eleanor has only been gone 14 months. "I know how long Eleanor has been gone," Mara said. "The children remind me in small ways every day. I'm not unaware of it." "We're only concerned for the family," Mrs. Caulfield said. Mara set her cup down. She looked at the 3 of them. These women who had decided what she was before she'd arrived, and had been running the same calculation ever since, adjusting for evidence but never quite revising the conclusion. She'd been quiet about this for 4 months. She'd been patient and measured and careful. She'd absorbed the looks in Harlow and Agnes Holloway's concerned tone, and Mrs. Caulfield's inspection visit, and the bank officer's implication. And she'd kept going because keeping going was what she did. But she was in her own parlor now, or close enough to hers that the distinction had blurred. And these women were sitting in it telling her that the family she had spent 4 months holding together perhaps needed protecting from her. And she found, sitting there with her hands in her lap, that she had run out of patience for it. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, and her voice came out quiet and completely without apology. "I came to this house in November with 1 bag and $32, and no one who expected me to succeed. I have been here through a hard winter and a near disaster with one of the children, and more mornings than I can count where I woke up, and the temperature had dropped, and there was work to do that nobody was going to do if I didn't do it. I've run this house and looked after these children and done it because it needed doing and because I chose to stay when I could have left. And I chose to keep going when it would have been easier not to." She paused. "I'm not after anything. I'm not calculating anything. I am a person who was given a chance at something real, and I have tried very hard to deserve it. That's the whole of it. And I understand that's not the story some people in this town have decided to tell about me, but I'm afraid I can no longer spend my energy managing that." The parlor was very quiet. Agnes Holloway looked at her with an expression that had shifted, not quite arrived somewhere better, but moved. Ida Crane was looking at her hands. Mrs. Caulfield had the expression of someone who has underestimated something and is recalculating. "I didn't say—" Agnes started. "I know what you said," Mara said, "and I know what you meant. And I'm going to ask you to go back to Harlow and tell people what you found here, which is a house that's in order, and children who are being looked after, and a man who's made a decision about his own life. That's what's true. Everything else is speculation." They left 20 minutes later with less to say than they'd arrived with, which Mara counted as adequate. She stood at the window and watched the wagon go and felt the particular trembling in her hands that came after she'd done something that cost her. Not the physical trembling of Ruth's room, but the deeper one that came from having held a line she'd been afraid to hold. She was still standing there when Silas's wagon came up the track from the other direction, returning from the south pasture, and she watched him climb down and hitch the horse and look up at the house with the particular look he had, assessing, practical, and underneath it something she was only recently allowing herself to name. He came inside and stopped when he saw her face. What happened? She told him. All of it. The three women, the conversation, what she'd said. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about Silas Mercer she had come to value beyond most of his other qualities. He listened like he meant it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. Good? You should have said it sooner. He said it without blame, just fact. I should have said it myself. I've been... He stopped, rubbed a hand over his jaw in the way he did when he was being honest about something uncomfortable. I've been too careful, too worried about what it costs to push back. So have I, she said. Then we stop being careful, he said. He said it simply, the way he said things that had been decided. What we are is not something we owe an explanation for. Not to them, not to the bank, not to anyone. She looked at him. That's easy to say. I know. He looked back at her steadily. But I mean it. She believed him. That was the thing about Silas Mercer. He said very little, and when he said something, he meant it entirely. She had learned to trust that in the same way she'd learned to trust the stove draft, the weight of the winter clouds, the things in this place that had their own consistent rules. There's going to be more of it, she said, before it stops. Probably, he agreed. Are you going to be all right with that? She thought about November, the wagon through the flooded creek, the gray house, his assessing eyes. She thought about Ruth's fever and the botanical drawings, and 4 a.m. with tea. She thought about everything she'd built here, one small thing at a time, in a house that hadn't been hers and was becoming hers in the only way that actually meant anything, which was by choosing it every day when you could have chosen to leave. Yes, she said, I'm going to be all right with it. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. Then he went to the stove and poured himself coffee, because that was always what he did. And she sat down at the kitchen table, and the house was quiet around them. And outside, the March sky was doing something tentative and not quite believable, which was the first thin suggestion of pale warmth. Not spring yet, not even close, but something was shifting. She could feel it in the air, the way you can feel weather changing before you can name what it's changing into. She sat with that, and let it be uncertain, and found that she could. Spring did not arrive gracefully at Iron Ridge. It came the way most honest things come, sideways, inconsistent, trailing the evidence of everything that had preceded it. The snow melted in patches, leaving the yard a mess of mud and dead grass, and the occasional frozen pocket that hadn't gotten the message yet. The creek ran high and loud. The calves, 16 of them, moved in the north pasture with the slightly bewildered energy of creatures who had survived something without fully understanding what. Mara stood at the kitchen window on an April morning and watched the mud and thought that she had never found anything so encouraging in her life. The wedding had been set for the second Saturday of April, which Reverend Marsh had offered without the warmth she might have hoped for, but with a professionalism she respected. Silas had gone to see him alone the first time and come back with a date and a set jaw and not much else. And when she'd asked how it had gone, he'd said, fine, which she'd learned covered a range of things. She didn't push it. The date was what mattered. The week before the wedding, she received a letter. It came in the Harlow mail, addressed in handwriting she didn't immediately recognize, and she opened it at the kitchen table while the children were at their lessons, and Silas was in the barn because she'd learned to open uncertain things when she was alone and had time to absorb whatever they contained. It was from her Aunt Clara, not a long letter. Clara had never been a long letter writer. 3 paragraphs, in the careful script of a woman who had chosen every word. She had heard, through a chain of connections Mara couldn't fully trace, that her niece was to be married. She wished her well. She said, in the second paragraph, that she hoped Mara knew she had not been sent away out of cruelty, but out of a situation that had been beyond Clara's managing, which Mara had known and had also not known. In the complicated way, you know things that hurt you. In the third paragraph, she said she was glad Mara had found something real. That was the phrase, something real. Mara read it 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and went back to the bread she was making, and she thought about her aunt. A woman who had been overwhelmed and had made a hard choice and had lived with it and had written a letter when she didn't have to. and she thought about the ways people fail each other without meaning to, and the ways they sometimes, too late but not never, find the words they should have said. She wrote back that evening. Not a long letter either. She said she was well. She said the ranch was difficult and worth it. She said she hoped Clara was the same. She did not say I forgive you because she was not entirely sure that was where she was yet, but she said enough that the door, which had been closed, was at least no longer locked. She mailed it the next time Hicks came through. The morning of the wedding was cold and bright. The particular clarity that comes when April decides, briefly and without warning, to be generous. The sky was the kind of blue that seemed lit from behind. Frost still on the grass at dawn, gone by 9. She dressed in the room that had been hers since November, the small room with the east window and the dresser with the missing handle. And she did her hair in her mother's mirror with hands that were not quite steady and that she did not try to force into steadiness, because some mornings you let your hands shake and you get dressed anyway. The dress was not new. She hadn't had the resources for new, and she wouldn't have wanted to spend them that way even if she had. It was the better of her 2 good dresses, a dark blue wool that she'd let out at the sleeves and pressed 3 times in the past week until it held its shape properly. She looked at herself in the small mirror and thought, this is what I have, and it is enough, and it is honest, which was how she preferred to begin things. Eliza knocked on the door. Come in, Mara said. Eliza came in wearing her good dress, which Mara had mended at the hem 2 weeks ago without making it a production. The girl's hair had been done in proper braids. She'd done it herself, which Mara knew, and it showed slightly, and Mara thought it was perfect. She was holding something, a small thing, in her closed hand. It was Mama's, Eliza said, without preamble. She opened her hand. It was a brooch, small, silver, a simple leaf shape, the kind of thing a person wears not because it's valuable, but because it means something. Papa gave it to her when they were married. He gave it to me last week and said maybe you'd want to wear it today. She paused. You don't have to. Mara looked at the brooch in Eliza's palm for a moment. There was no clean way to receive something like this. No response that covered it properly. It was not a replacement and was not meant as one, and both of them knew it. It was something more specific, an acknowledgement from a man who struggled with words that what was being built here was not built against what had come before but alongside it, in the space that grief had eventually, reluctantly, made room for. I'd be honored, Mara said, and meant it exactly. Eliza pinned it herself, with the focused concentration of someone who has decided to do a thing properly. Her hands were steadier than Mara's, which Mara found both touching and entirely typical of Eliza Mercer. There, Eliza said, stepping back to look. Good. Good, Mara agreed. They looked at each other in the small room, the woman and the girl, and there was something between them that had been building since November in the particular way that real things build. Not smoothly, not without friction, but with the specific weight of things that have been tested and held. I'm glad you stayed, Eliza said. Simply, directly, the way she said everything. So am I, Mara said. They went downstairs together. The ceremony itself was small because Silas had not wanted a production, and Mara had not wanted one either, and the decision had been the first thing they'd agreed on without any discussion, which had seemed like a good sign. Reverend Marsh officiated with the efficient warmth of a man who had decided that his personal reservations were not the relevant thing here. Hicks and his wife were there, the closest thing to neutral ground that Harlow offered, and Calloway had come, which had surprised Mara until she remembered that he was the kind of man who showed up for things that mattered. The children stood in a row, Eliza composed, Daniel in his cleaned boots and a collar that was slightly too tight, Ruth in her good dress with the doll Mara had made her at Christmas tucked under one arm because she had refused at the last moment to leave it behind, and nobody had argued with her about it. Silas stood at the front of the small room in his cleanest clothes, not new, but pressed, and he'd shaved properly, which was not always the case. And when she came in, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before and recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who has arrived at something he'd stopped believing in without knowing it had become possible again. She walked toward him and he reached out his hand and she took it, and it was not graceful or scripted, and his hand was as rough as it always was, and hers was still not entirely steady, and none of that was wrong. Reverend Marsh spoke the words. They said theirs. The ring was a simple band. He'd asked her size by measuring the circumference of a piece of string she'd been using for the bread, which she'd only figured out 3 days later. And when she'd had to go stand at the east window for a minute. When it was done, Ruth said, "Good," with the same finality she'd applied to every other occasion where the outcome was satisfactory, and Daniel shook Silas's hand with a seriousness that made Calloway's mouth twitch, and Eliza looked at the floor and then at Mara and nodded once, which was Eliza's version of everything she couldn't say. Hicks's wife had brought a cake, which was more than anyone had expected, and was received with the particular gratitude of a household that had been living on practical necessities for months. It was a good cake. Mara ate 2 pieces and did not apologize for it. The town's reaction arrived in pieces over the following weeks, the way the town's reaction always arrived. Indirectly, by implication, through the small adjustments people make when a situation is changed and they're deciding how to update their behavior. Mrs. Caulfield did not come to call. Agnes Holloway also did not come to call. Whether this was disapproval or concession or simply the recognition that the argument had concluded without them, Mara couldn't say with certainty, and she found increasingly that she didn't require the certainty. They would adjust or they wouldn't. Harlow would find its way to accepting this or it wouldn't, and either way, Iron Ridge would go on. What she did not expect was Ida Crane. Ida came alone on a Wednesday in late April without the protective geometry of the committee. She was carrying a jar of preserves, which she held out at the door with an expression that was genuinely uncertain. A woman who had decided to do something and wasn't entirely sure it was the right thing, but was doing it anyway. "I wanted to come," she said simply, "to say congratulations, properly." Mara looked at her for a moment. Ida Crane, who had been soft-voiced and gentle, and therefore the most dangerous of the 3, who had said he's still grieving in a tone of such careful concern that it had taken Mara a moment to identify what was underneath it. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." Ida sat at the kitchen table and wrapped her hands around her cup, and after a moment she said, "I owe you an apology, I think." "You don't have to—" "I do." She looked up. "I told myself I was concerned for the children, and I was, genuinely. But I also—" She paused, finding the honest version. "I think I decided what you were before I knew you, and I kept adjusting the story to fit what I'd decided, rather than—" She stopped. "That's not fair to a person." "No," Mara agreed without heat. "It's not." "For what it's worth," Ida said, "what I've heard from people who've seen the house, seen the children, it doesn't match what I thought." She looked at her cup. Ruth Mercer apparently told the Reverend's daughter that she's not scared of the windows anymore. Mara was quiet for a moment. "Small things matter," she said. "Yes," said Ida, "I think that's true." They drank their tea. It was not a full reconciliation. Those take longer and require more than one conversation. But it was a beginning, and Mara had learned over the course of this year to recognize beginnings for what they were, rather than holding out for something more complete. May came to Iron Ridge the way May should, which was warmer than anyone quite trusted at first. The grass went green with a suddenness that felt almost aggressive after so many months of brown and gray. The calves grew fat. The horses stood in the corral with their faces turned toward the sun, with the specific contentment of animals who have been cold for a long time. Silas fixed the north fence properly, the job that had been half done since the previous fall, on a Saturday in early May. And Mara brought lunch out to him because she'd been bringing food to the barn since December, and saw no reason to stop simply because the circumstances had changed. She found him on his knees in the mud with a fence post and a look of concentrated irritation that she recognized as meaning the post was not cooperating. She set the food down on a flat rock nearby and crouched and held the post steady without being asked. He looked at her sideways. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. He drove the post in. They tested it together. It held. He sat back on his heels and looked at it with the satisfaction of something correctly done. "The whole section needs redoing eventually," he said. "Next fall," she suggested, "before the winter sets in. We'll have the resources by then if the summer goes as it should." "It will," she said. He looked at her sideways again, the same look he'd been giving her since November, assessing, revising, finding. "You always say that," he said. "I say it when I believe it," she said. "I don't say it when I don't." He thought about this. Then he picked up the food she'd brought and sat in the mud with his back against the fixed fence post and ate. And she sat beside him because the mud was not a reason not to sit. And the sun came over the hill to the east and was genuinely warm for the first time all year. Daniel appeared from the direction of the barn with a carving in his hand and sat down in the grass a few feet away with the easy familiarity of a child who no longer needed to announce himself before entering a space. He'd been doing that more, moving through the family's orbit without the careful calibration he'd used in November, the constant checking of whether he was welcome. She noticed these things the way she noticed all the small shifts in this family, with a gratitude she kept mostly to herself because they weren't the kind of thing you made a speech about. "What's that one?" she asked, nodding at the carving. "The gray calf," he said. "The one with the patch." He held it up. She could see the patch. A deliberate texture he'd worked into the wood, different from the smooth surface around it. It was genuinely good. Not perfect. The proportions were still slightly off, the legs slightly too long, but there was life in it that had nothing to do with technical accuracy and everything to do with the fact that he'd looked at the actual calf and tried to get at what was real about it rather than what was correct. "The legs are better," she said. He looked pleased, which he covered with a shrug. Silas looked at the carving too. "That's the gray one," he said. "Yes," Daniel said. "The legs are better," Silas agreed. Daniel's shrug this time was slightly less successful at covering the pleased. Eliza found them there 20 minutes later, father and son and the woman who was now wife and stepmother, sitting in the mud and the new grass at the edge of the fixed fence line in the May sun. And she stood for a moment looking at the scene with her arms crossed and the expression she wore when she was privately satisfied about something she'd decided not to take credit for. "Ruth's asking for lunch," she said. "Tell her 5 minutes," Mara said. "She's been saying 5 minutes for 20 minutes. "Then tell her 10. Eliza looked at the fixed fence post. "Is it done?" "Good as it's been in years," Silas said. Eliza nodded, and the satisfaction in her face went 1 degree more open, and she turned back toward the house. "Eliza," Mara said. She stopped, turned. "Thank you for the brooch, for your father giving it." Eliza looked at her for a moment. The composure did its small familiar adjustment, the one that meant something was happening underneath it. "It looked right on you," she said finally. "That's all." She went back to the house. Silas watched her go. "She's going to be something," he said quietly. "She already is," Mara said. He was quiet for a moment, then, I know she still misses Eleanor. They all do. I do." He said it carefully, the way he said the things that mattered. "I need you to know that this, what we are now, it doesn't mean I know," Mara said. "I've never thought that." He looked at her. "Most people would need more than—" "I'm not most people," she said. "I know what this is. I know what it's built on, and I know what it's built beside." She paused. "Eleanor made this family. I'm not replacing that. I'm just here for whatever comes next." He held her gaze for a long moment. This man who was better at doing than saying and had been trying to say things anyway, all year, in every way he had available. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She believed him. She had been learning, all her life, which things to believe and which things were performance, and Silas Mercer had never once performed anything. It was his most difficult quality and his most reliable one. They went inside. The summer stretched out in front of Iron Ridge with the particular promise of a season that hasn't been earned yet, but is arriving anyway, which is the best kind. The kind you can't take for granted because you know too well what preceded it. The cattle grew, the calves fattened, the bank payment was made in May, on time, with the slight excess that meant they were ahead of the line aldermen had drawn rather than on it. And when Silas came home from that trip, he set his hat on the table and said, "It's done," and sat down and was quiet for a long time, and Mara let him be quiet because some things need space before they're real. The house changed in ways she hadn't planned for. Not big changes. She hadn't expected those. Had never believed that the act of saying certain words in front of a reverend transformed anything overnight. The changes were the small ones that accumulate until one day you look around and the room looks different, and you can't point to any single thing that moved. Daniel started coming to her with his carvings first, before he showed anyone else. She didn't know when that had started. She noticed it one morning and realized it had been happening for weeks. Ruth began calling her by her first name in the evenings. Not all the time, not formally, just sometimes, in the way children do when they're testing whether something is allowed and finding that it is. Eliza, on a rainy Thursday in June, sat down next to her at the kitchen table and asked her to explain the annotation system she'd used in the botanical drawings. Which plants were medicinal, which were simply beautiful, how she'd decided what was worth noting. They sat there for 2 hours going through it, Eliza taking her own notes in her careful script, and at the end of it, Eliza said, "I want to make my own book." And Mara said, "Then we'll start one." And they did. Silas was not transformed. That was the truth of it. He was still the man who said very little and meant all of it, who woke before dawn and worked until dark, and came to the table smelling of barn and effort, and sat with his family in the specific silence of someone who is present without performing presence. He was still closed around the things that hurt him, and opened only in the small moments. His hand on Ruth's face, his voice when he was showing Daniel the carving angles, the way he came to stand beside Mara sometimes when she was at the stove, not touching, not speaking, just there. But she had stopped needing him to be different. That was the thing she hadn't expected to discover. She had spent her whole life in houses that almost fit, rooms that were close to right, families that were almost hers, spaces where she was useful but not essential. She had adapted to all of them with the patience of someone who has learned that patience is the price of surviving, and she had told herself that adaptation was enough, and she had been wrong about that. But you can only know that once you find the alternative. The alternative was this: a kitchen that was hers in the only sense that mattered, a man who was difficult and real, children who needed her in ways that were specific and honest, a piece of land that was hard and worth the hardness, a brooch on a blue dress, and a cracked window she'd packed with rags in November and never mentioned again. Not perfect, not smooth, not the version of things that exists in stories where everything resolves cleanly and every wound closes without a scar. Real. Which was harder than perfect and worth considerably more. Harlow made its adjustments, as towns do. Mrs. Caulfield remained cool in the specific manner of someone who has not changed their mind but has decided to stop expressing it, which was an acceptable compromise. Agnes Holloway learned to greet Mara by name, which she delivered with the slight effort of a person still getting used to the weight of it. Ida Crane became, over the summer months, something closer to genuine. She came by twice in June and once in July, and by the third visit she and Mara were sitting at the kitchen table talking about things that had nothing to do with judgment or measurement, just two women with things in common finding them. There were still people in Harlow who kept their distance. There would always be some. The frontier had its long memories and its longer opinions, and Mara had learned not to expect the impossible thing, which was the unanimous approval of people who had decided without knowing her. What she had was better than that. She had specific people who knew her specifically, who had seen her at 4 a.m. with a sick child, who had eaten her 80% fruitcake and called it the best thing they'd ever had, who had watched her hold the fence post in the mud and not make anything of it. That kind of knowing takes longer and means more, and you can't manufacture it by being palatable to people who've never looked at you directly. She understood this the way she understood it in her bones, the way you understand things that you've earned through the particular curriculum of a life that hasn't been easy. On an evening in late July, she stood at the east window of the room that was now hers and Silas's, and looked out at Iron Ridge the way she'd looked at it in November from the small room's window. The yard, the barn, the corral, the hills beyond turning gold in the late light. Ruth was visible in the yard below, talking to one of the calves through the fence slats with the earnest diplomacy she applied to all creatures. Daniel was in the barn doorway with a piece of wood and a penknife. Eliza was somewhere in the house. She could hear her moving around. Silas came up behind her. He didn't put his arm around her. He was not a man who did things like that as a matter of course. But he stood close, his shoulder a few inches from hers, and looked out at what she was looking at. "The gray calf is bigger," she said. "He'll be a good animal," Silas said. "Daniel's going to be upset when he's sold. He already knows it's coming." A pause. "He's been carving a good version of him all month. I think it's his way of keeping something." She looked at Silas briefly, sideways. He was watching his son in the barn doorway with the expression she'd seen on his face in Ruth's room, unguarded, the version of him that existed before he remembered to manage it. "That's very perceptive," she said. He glanced at her. "I've been paying more attention," he said simply. "You taught me that." She turned back to the window. The light was going soft on the hills, and the calves moved slow in the pasture, and Ruth was laughing at something the calf had done, a small, bright sound traveling up through the window glass. And Mara stood there and let herself have it, all of it. The hard year and the cold and the gossip and the storm and the fever and the kitchen at 4 in the morning and the brooch and the mud and the fixed fence and the bread. She'd gotten better at baking. Still not perfect, but better. Let herself hold all of it without trying to sort it into the parts that were good and the parts that weren't, because that was not how real things worked. Real things came whole. You took them that way, or you didn't take them. She had taken this one. She had $32 when she came. She had come from nowhere and been passed around and made herself useful in houses that weren't hers, and told herself that was enough, because she hadn't known what enough actually felt like. Now she knew. It didn't look the way she'd have imagined it, if she'd been the kind of person who let herself imagine. It looked like mud, and a difficult man, and 3 children who needed different things, and a house that was always going to have something wrong with it. It looked like a brooch that belonged to someone else first, and a name that was new, and a piece of land that would be hard for the rest of her life. It felt like the first thing she'd ever stood on that didn't shift when she put her weight on it. Below, Ruth had given up on the calf and was heading back to the house, the doll under one arm as always, her boots leaving small prints in the soft evening ground. She looked up at the window and saw Mara and waved with the easy confidence of a child who has stopped being surprised that someone is there when she looks. Mara waved back. The hills went gold, then amber, then the long blue of a summer evening settling in. Iron Ridge held.